They found the diary buried under 6 inches of dead bees, pressed between 2 slabs of honeycomb so thick with wax that the leather cover had fused to it like skin to bone. The pages inside were written in a girl's careful hand, and the first entry read, "My father has not spoken a word in 11 years, but the bees understand him perfectly, and I believe they love him more than any voice could earn." That was how the town of Harlan Crossing, Wyoming, finally learned the truth about Silas Wren, the mute farmer who had lived inside the walls of the abandoned territorial prison for 4 decades. And that was how they learned about the daughter no one knew existed, the woman who had kept the most extraordinary secret in the history of the High Plains. But this story does not begin with a diary. It begins with a scream. In the autumn of 1858, a 23-year-old bride named Colette Deschamps Wren pressed her hand against her swollen belly and watched 4 men drag her husband off their homestead in chains. Silas had not committed the crime they accused him of. He had not stolen Jebediah Polk's cattle. But Jebediah Polk owned the bank, and the bank owned the sheriff, and the sheriff owed Polk $300 in gambling debts, and so Silas Wren was convicted in a trial that lasted 11 minutes. They sentenced him to 15 years in the Wyoming Territorial Prison, a limestone fortress at the edge of the Laramie River, where the walls were 3 feet thick and the winter wind cut through the bars like a blade made of ice. Colette stood in the mud outside the courthouse, 7 months pregnant, and watched the wagon carry her husband away. A woman beside her, the wife of the general store owner, leaned close and whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Poor thing. She married a thief, and now she will die a pauper. The child will not see Christmas." Colette did not cry. She pressed her lips together until they went white, and she walked back to the homestead alone, 4 miles through a November wind that smelled of snow and iron. She would not die a pauper. She would not lose the child. And she would find a way to be near her husband, even if it meant living in the shadow of the prison itself. What she did next would take 40 years to understand. The homestead was gone within a month. Hawk seized it for unpaid debts that Colette suspected were invented. She sold what she could carry: the cast-iron skillet, the rocking chair Silas had built, her mother's French Bible. She kept only 3 things: a wool blanket her grandmother had woven in Quebec, a pouch of lavender seeds, and a small leather journal, blank, which she intended to fill with everything she wanted to tell Silas but could not. She gave birth to a daughter in December, alone in a rented room above the blacksmith's shop in Laramie, with no midwife and no help except a neighbor's dog that lay across her feet and kept them warm. She named the girl Marguerite after her mother. And then, in the spring of 1859, Colette Wren did something that the people of Laramie would talk about for decades. She walked to the abandoned east wing of the territorial prison, the section that had been condemned after a fire in 1855, and she moved in. No one stopped her because no one cared. The east wing was a ruin. The roof had collapsed in 2 places. The walls were black with soot. The iron cell doors hung open like broken teeth. The warden at the time, a man named Crutchfield, saw her carrying the baby through the rubble and laughed so hard he had to sit down. "Let her rot in there," he told his guards. "She will leave when the first frost takes the child." He was wrong. Colette had grown up in the mining country of northern Quebec, where her grandmother had taught her something most Americans did not understand. The earth itself is a blanket. If you go deep enough, the ground holds its warmth the way a mother holds a child: constant, patient, unyielding. In Quebec, the old women called it chaleur de la terre, the heat of the earth. The east wing of the prison had something that no one had noticed because no one had reason to look. Beneath the lowest cells, below the stone foundation, there was a natural fissure in the limestone, and through that fissure, warm air rose from a geothermal spring deep underground. The floor of the lowest cell block, even in January, was warm to the touch. Not hot, not scalding, just warm, the way sun-baked stone feels at dusk, holding the memory of daylight. Colette felt it the first time she pressed her palm to the floor. And she knew she would make this work. The first winter was the hardest thing she had ever endured, and she had endured plenty. She sealed the broken sections of roof with layers of sod cut from the prairie, stacking them the way her grandmother had described the old habitant homes of New France. Grass side down, roots woven together, each layer pressed tight against the next until the gaps disappeared. The sod was heavy. Her arms ached until she could not lift Marguerite without wincing. But sod is one of the finest insulators the natural world provides. 12 inches of packed earth holds heat the way glass holds light, completely, generously, without condition. She dragged fallen timbers from the prison yard and braced the remaining roof beams. She chinked the gaps between the limestone blocks with a mixture of clay, straw, and ash, the same recipe that French-Canadian settlers had used for 200 years. She hung the wool blanket across the entrance to the cell block she had chosen as their living quarters, and behind that blanket, with the geothermal warmth rising from below and the sod roof trapping it above, the temperature held steady at 55 degrees, even when the world outside dropped to 30 below zero. 55 degrees is not comfortable, but it is survivable, and for Colette, survivable was enough. She visited Silas every week through the interior wall that separated the condemned east wing from the active prison. There was a drainage grate in the floor, a gap no wider than a man's hand, and she would lie on the cold stone and press her lips to the iron bars and whisper to him. She told him about Marguerite, about the warm floor, about the lavender she had planted in the prison yard, which had taken root despite everything, the way stubborn things do. Silas could not answer. He had stopped speaking the day they convicted him, not because his voice was broken, but because he had decided that a world which could take everything from an innocent man did not deserve to hear him speak. The guards called him the mute. They mocked him. They poured water on his bedding in winter. But Silas endured the way the stone endured, by holding what warmth he had deep inside where no one could reach it. It was during his 3rd year in prison that Silas discovered the bees. A swarm had built a colony in the south wall of his cell, in a crack between 2 limestone blocks where the mortar had crumbled. Most prisoners would have smashed the hive, but Silas watched them. He watched the way they moved, deliberate, purposeful, each one carrying out a task that served the whole. He watched the way they built their comb, hexagon by hexagon, with a precision that no carpenter could match. And he began to understand them. He never used smock. He never wore gloves. He simply moved slowly, breathed slowly, and let the bees crawl across his hands and face and neck without flinching. The guards thought he was mad, but the bees never stung him, not once in 40 years. Colette told Marguerite about the bees before the girl was old enough to understand words. She described the sound of them, the low hum that vibrated through the drainage grate like a lullaby sung by 10,000 tiny voices. When Marguerite was 5, Colette lowered a small jar through the grate, and Silas filled it with honey. It was the first sweet thing the girl had ever tasted. She licked the jar clean and then held it up to the light and stared at the amber residue as if she were looking at liquid gold, which, in a way, she was. By 1865, Colette had transformed the East Wing into something no one in Laramie could have imagined. She had dug a shallow trench from the geothermal fissure to a clay-lined basin, creating a warm water reservoir that she used for washing, cooking, and bathing. She had built a root cellar in the deepest cell where the constant underground temperature of 50 degrees kept potatoes, turnips, and carrots through the winter without spoiling. She had learned to make tallow candles from rendered beef fat traded for lavender sachets, and she had taught herself to preserve meat by smoking it over sagebrush fires in the old prison chimney, which drew air upward with a draft so perfect it might have been designed for the purpose. She kept 2 goats in the yard, a rooster and 4 hens, and an old guard shack. She grew squash and beans in the prison yard, where the southern wall reflected heat and created a microclimate warm enough to extend the growing season by 3 weeks. And every week, through the grate, Silas sent up honey. The people of Laramie knew about Colette. They whispered about her the way people whisper about things they do not understand. The crazy Frenchwoman in the prison, living like a rat, raising a child in a cage. They did not visit. they did not help. And when Marguerite walked to town to trade honey for flour, the children threw stones and called her the ghost girl. Marguerite was quiet like her father. Not mute, but careful with words, as if each one cost something she could not afford to waste. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's steady hands, and by the age of 12, she could handle a bee colony with the same silent confidence that Silas had mastered through the grate. The bees moved across her fingers like water over smooth stone. She spoke to them in French, the language her mother used for prayers in secret. She also kept a diary. It was the blank journal Colette had carried from the homestead, the one she had intended to fill with messages to Silas. Instead, she gave it to Marguerite on the girl's 7th birthday and said, "Write everything. Someday, when your father is free, he will want to know what he missed." Marguerite wrote everything. She wrote about the way the warm floor felt against her cheek on winter mornings. She wrote about the sound of the bees through the grate, how the pitch changed with the seasons, higher in summer, lower in winter, as if the hive itself were breathing with the rhythm of the earth. She wrote about her mother's hands, cracked and raw from lye soap, but gentle when they braided her hair. She wrote about the taste of honey on sourdough bread, the smell of sage smoke in the chimney, the way starlight looked through the gaps in the sod roof, broken into pieces like a shattered mirror, each piece holding a tiny perfect sky. She wrote, "Papa sent up a comb today with a perfect queen cell on it. Mama says it looks like a little cathedral. I think it looks like a promise." Silas was released in 1873. He had served his 15 years. He walked out of the prison's west gate and around to the east wing, and Colette was waiting for him in the doorway with Marguerite behind her, 15 years old, tall, quiet, holding a jar of honey. Silas looked at his daughter. He looked at the transformed ruin, the sod roof, the goats, the lavender growing along the wall, the bees, his bees, humming in the south wall where the colony had expanded into a hive so vast it filled an entire corridor. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He had not spoken in 15 years, and the silence had become a part of them, the way the limestone had become a part of the prison, molecular, irreversible. He tried. Colette saw the cords of his neck tighten, saw his jaw work, saw the effort in his eyes. But the words would not come. Marguerite stepped forward and took his hand and placed it on the hive wall. The vibration of 10,000 bees hummed through his fingers, up his arm, into his chest. And Silas closed his eyes and let out a breath that was not a word, but was, somehow, everything he needed to say. He never left the prison again. Colette had expected him to want to reclaim their land, to fight, to rebuild somewhere new. But Silas had spent 15 years watching the bees build their world inside stone walls, and he had come to believe that home is not a place you claim. It is a place that claims you. The prison had claimed him. The bees had claimed him. The warm floor, the limestone, the sound of his daughter's voice reading to him through the grate for all those years, these things had built a home more real than any homestead. So they stayed. And for the next 25 years, Silas Wren became the greatest beekeeper the Wyoming Territory had ever known. He expanded the hive to the entire east wing, using the natural warmth of the geothermal fissure to keep the colonies alive through winters that killed every other hive within 200 miles. He bred queens for resilience. He harvested honey so pure and golden that traders came from as far as Denver to buy it. He never spoke a word to any of them. Colette handled the business, Marguerite handled the bees, and the town of Harlan Crossing, which had grown up around the prison like moss around a stone, regarded the Wrens with a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect. They bought the honey. They whispered about the mute and his ghost daughter, but they kept their distance until the winter of 1898. They called it the Devil's Winter. It began in October with a frost so sudden it killed standing cattle in the fields. By November, the snow was 4 feet deep on level ground and drifting to 12 feet against buildings. The temperature dropped to 41 degrees below zero. 41 below. At that temperature, exposed skin freezes in under 5 minutes. Water thrown into the air comes down as ice crystals. The sap inside pine trees freezes, and the trunk split open with a sound like rifle shots. The blizzard that struck on December 7 lasted 9 days. 9 days. The wind came from the northwest at 60 miles per hour, driving snow so thick that a man could not see his own hand in front of his face. The temperature during the blizzard never rose above 35 below. Firewood ran out in most homes by the 3rd day. The general store's roof collapsed under the weight of snow on the 5th day, burying the winter supply of flour, salt, and dried meat. 2 families lost their homes entirely when the wind tore the roofs away like paper. By the 7th day, people were burning furniture. By the 8th day, they were burning books. On the 9th day, Ezekiel Polk, the son of the man who had put Silas in prison 40 years earlier, stood in the ruins of his father's bank building, which had crumbled under the snow, and stared at the east wing of the old prison. Smoke was rising from the chimney. Not much. Just a thin gray thread, steady and calm, as if the building did not know that the world outside was dying. He walked through waist-deep snow for 200 yards. It took him an hour. When he reached the prison's east wing, he pounded on the heavy door with fists he could no longer feel. Marguerite opened it. She was 58 years old now. Her hair was silver at the temples. Her hands were steady. Behind her, Ezekiel could feel the warmth pouring out of the doorway like breath from a living thing, and the smell hit him: honey, lavender, wood smoke, warm bread, the smell of a world that had no business existing in the middle of the worst blizzard in Wyoming history. He stared. The corridor behind Marguerite was lit by tallow candles and lined with honeycomb. The walls glowed amber. The air hummed with the sound of bees, thousands of them, alive and working in the dead of winter, warmed by the geothermal heat that rose through the floor like a pulse. There were shelves of preserved food, jars of honey, smoked meat hanging from the ceiling, root vegetables packed in sand. There was a basin of warm water steaming gently in the corner. There were blankets. There were beds made from straw and wool. There was Silas, 83 years old, sitting beside the main hive with his palm pressed flat against the comb, his eyes closed, his face as calm as a man, listening to music only he could hear. And there was Colette's grave, marked with a simple limestone slab in the prison yard, covered now in 4 feet of snow, where she had been buried 3 years earlier after a quiet death in her sleep, her hand resting on a jar of honey, her last words to Marguerite being, "The earth keeps what you give it. Remember that." Ezekiel Polk opened his mouth. His lips were cracked. His beard was crusted with ice. He said, "Please." Marguerite looked at him for a long time. She knew his name. She knew what his father had done. She knew that this man had once thrown a stone at her when she was 12 years old, walking to town with a jar of honey, and that the stone had cut her above the left eye, and that the scar was still there, a thin white line that she touched sometimes without thinking. She stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "Bring everyone." Over the next 3 days, 47 people from Harlan Crossing crowded into the east wing of the abandoned prison. Marguerite organized them with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had spent her entire life managing resources in a confined space. She rationed the food. She assigned sleeping areas. She heated water from the geothermal basin for the children first, then the elderly, then everyone else. She treated frostbite with a salve made from beeswax, rendered fat, and dry calendula flowers, a recipe her mother had learned from the Arapaho women who camped near the prison in the 1860s. The bees hummed through it all, undisturbed, their warmth radiating through the walls like a second heartbeat. Silas sat among the townspeople who had mocked him, imprisoned him, stolen his land, thrown stones at his daughter. He did not speak. He could not speak, but he moved among them with jars of honey, offering each person a spoonful, the way a priest offers communion, without judgment, without hesitation, with the simple understanding that warmth is not something you earn. It is something you share. On the second night, the oldest child in the group, a boy of 14, sat beside Silas and watched him tend the hive. The boy asked, "How do you know what they need if you cannot talk to them?" Silas looked at the boy. He placed the boy's hand against the hive wall. The vibration traveled through the boy's fingers, up his arm, into his chest. The boy's eyes went wide. Marguerite, watching from across the room, smiled. She opened her diary and wrote, "A boy learned to listen today. Not with his ears, with his hands." Papa would say, if he could say anything, that this is how the world was meant to work. You do not need words to be understood. You need patience. You need warmth. You need to stop talking long enough to feel what is already there. The blizzard broke on December 16th. The sun came out for the first time in 9 days, and the light on the snow was so blinding that people wept just looking at it. The town was devastated. 14 buildings had collapsed. Livestock had perished by the hundreds. The water well was frozen solid. But every person in Harlan Crossing was alive, and every one of them had been fed and warmed by a mute beekeeper and his daughter living inside a prison that the town had laughed at for 40 years. Ezekiel Polk stood in the prison yard on that first morning after the blizzard. He looked at the limestone walls, the sod roof, the lavender bushes buried under snow, but alive at the roots, the way stubborn things are. He looked at Colette's grave. He removed his hat. "I am sorry," he said, "not just for this winter, for everything, for my father, for the stones, for all of it." Marguerite stood beside him. She did not touch him. She did not need to. "My mother used to say that the earth does not hold grudges," she said. "It just holds warmth." She would want me to do the same. That spring, the town rebuilt. But they did not rebuild the way they had before. Ezekiel Polk donated the land around the prison to Marguerite. The townspeople, working together for the first time in living memory, expanded the East Wing into a proper community shelter, using the techniques Colette had pioneered: sod insulation, clay chinking, the geothermal trench system, the root cellar. They built a proper apiary in the prison yard, and Marguerite taught 17 families how to keep bees. Silas died in the summer of 1900, quietly, in his sleep, his hand resting on the hive wall, the bees crawling gently across his fingers, as if saying goodbye in the only language they shared. He was 85. He had not spoken a word in 42 years. But every person in Harlan Crossing came to his funeral, and the silence was not empty. It was full the way a hive is full, humming with something deeper than words. Marguerite lived for another 12 years. She never married. She never left the prison. She tended the bees, and she filled the diary, page after page, year after year, until the leather cover was swollen with honeycomb, and the pages smelled of lavender and smoke and thyme. The last entry, written in a hand that trembled only slightly, read, "The hive is everything. It is home built from nothing. It is warmth held in stone. It is a family that speaks without speaking. Mama was right. The earth keeps what you give it. I gave it my whole life, and it gave me back everything Papa could not say out loud." When the great hive finally collapsed in 1912, 12 years after Silas died, the townspeople who came to clear the debris found the diary pressed between 2 slabs of honeycomb in the deepest cell, exactly where Marguerite had placed it, as if she had known that someday someone would need to hear this story. They read it aloud in the town square, every word, to a crowd that stood in silence. And when they reached the final page, the oldest man in Harlan Crossing, who had been the 14-year-old boy that Silas had taught to listen with his hands, said something that the town carved into the limestone above the prison door, where it remains to this day. He said, "She taught us that a prison can become a home, that silence can become a language, and that the people you throw away are sometimes the only ones who can save you." Do not wait for the blizzard to learn that lesson. The lavender still grows in the prison yard. The bees still hum in the south wall. And if you press your palm to the floor of the lowest cell, you can still feel it, faint but certain, rising from somewhere deep below, warmth that has been there all along, patient, constant, waiting for someone to notice.